Wildy West, a podcast dedicated to being a voice for wild horses. My name is Chase McGoran, and I will be your host. Let's save these horses together. All I ask you to do is listen. Alberta's wildies, also known as the mountain horse, are in danger. Today, we're going to talk about the government's flawed feral horse management framework that was thrown together under the guise of protecting the ecosystem without any regard for the latest scientific data. These horses are a breed unique to Alberta. Their ancestry traces back to the introduction by Foothills First Nations of Spanish horses brought to the Americas in the 1500s. Vast numbers used to roam the foothills of the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, until the government and special interest cattle ranchers decided they were a nuisance. Today, less than 1,500 of these iconic horses are left, roaming over 2.2 million acres of rugged foothills wilderness. What the government has planned this winter, based on their flawed framework, is cruel, unfounded, and is intended to advance their century-and-a-half-long mandate of equine genocide. My guest today is Wayne McCrory. Wayne McCrory is a world-renowned biologist. His bio on his newly published science review for ZooCheck of the Alberta Feral Horse Framework describes Mr. McCrory as a long-practicing registered professional biologist in British Columbia, with a wide range of experience in wildlife research, environmental impacts, and cumulative effects analysis, and management conservation issues in Western Canada. He has headed numerous research projects, including on Chilcotin free-roaming horses, mammal inventory in Yoho National Park, grizzly bears, black bears, western toads, mountain goats, Roosevelt elk, spirit Kermode bears, and other species. He is familiar with the ecology of the Alberta foothills, having mapped and studied grizzly bear habitat in Kananaskis country for 3 years with Dr. Stephen Herrero, and for producing a report for Alberta Fish and Wildlife on the history of the grizzly bear in K Country, Alberta. He was also a waterfowl researcher on the first environmental impact study of the Athabasca tar sands, Syncrude, and a wildlife researcher on a gas pipeline from Chief Mountain, Alberta to Trail, British Columbia. In 2015 to 2016, he carried out a professional review of feral horse management in Alberta for ZooCheck. Over the past 20 years, his research on wild horses in the BC Chilcotin has included field research on habitat use and response to wildfires, as well as genetic studies. He has also worked with the Haunagouateen Nation on a wild horse management plan and guidelines for wildlife and wild horse tourism viewing. I apologize, I couldn't say the full word for the Haunagouateen First Nations, as I couldn't find that final word and I didn't want to offend anyone, so hopefully it's just gonna appear on the screen here. He recently published a book on his wild horse research titled The Wild Horses of the Chilcotin, Their History and Future, which won the 2024 Basil Stewart Stubbs Prize for the best scholarly book by a Canadian author on a BC subject. It was given a starred review by the US Booklist for a work judged to be outstanding in its genre. He has produced over 100 wildlife reports, including a number of publications in peer-reviewed journals. He has produced or co-authored 3 reports on Chilcotin wild horses and is a co-author of 2 peer-reviewed scientific papers related to wild horses. One on the diet of Chilcotin wolves, and the other on the spread of the domestic horse across the Americas, which won the prestigious 2024 AAAS Newcomb Cleveland Prize for Outstanding Contribution to Science. His accolades and expertise in the subject are without doubt. So now I'd like to share with you the wealth of his knowledge and the depth of his insight on the situation faced by our wildies. Hi, Wayne. Thank you so much for joining us and taking time out of your Christmas month to be here today. Can you give an overview of the 2023 Alberta Feral Horse Management Framework and why it was developed?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because after the controversy in 2015 when the same agency implemented some culls and stirred up a lot of the public in Alberta who were opposed to that, and I did my own report at the time, things have been pretty quiet. The ministry in charge have been doing their helicopter count, and then all of a sudden, 9 years later, they come out with this new framework that doesn't come right out and say it, that they're going to have more calls, but when you read the sort of vague language about population control or measures to prevent overgrazing, that's a distinct possibility. So I think a lot of it's hard to say where it's coming from. Part of the problem is that even though I recommended in 2015 the Alberta foothills horses deserve to be reclassified as a special species and protected, they're still come under the Range Act as, they treat them like a livestock animal raised in barnyards. And here's an animal that science shows was introduced by First Nations 400 years ago to the foothills. So they're been living out there a long time in a pretty beautiful and wild ecosystem. So I think, I'm guessing some of the pressure is probably coming from the rancher community, who has on average 6 times more cattle out there for 6 months a year than there are wild horses. It's hard to say. For some reason, they feel they need to, quotes on, quotes off, manage this pretty interesting species that's been there a long time. And part of the problem is that they still haven't come up with any strong evidence that they're causing overgrazing. But nonetheless, here comes this framework, and they sort of developed what they consider refined methodology that's based largely on what they claim to be determined carrying capacity for cattle and wildlife and the wild horses. Some other factors, including input from the Feral Horse Advisory Committee and the Chief Science Committee and so on. So they're using this criteria and coming up with the thresholds, but once they're more rigorous and your helicopter counts come up with new numbers, done I think in February or March, if they reach a certain what they consider level, then they're going to have to implement control measures. And they have 3 sort of different thresholds in different colors. One is if the numbers are still consistently low, then they're going to take no action. The other one is sort of a middle one where they're going to look at some measures. And then the other one is what they call the red one, where they're going to go into immediate action and take measures to reduce or control the population. But they don't specifically come out and say they're going to take culls, but of course, whether you do contraception or adoption is still culling and removing the animals. So from the outside, when you look at the framework, it's quite well written and has science mostly from the chief scientist's input, and appears quite, unless you know all the circumstances, quite reasonable. And I think the foothills ecosystem, of which years ago I did grizzly bear research for 3 years in Kananaskis country and worked in the foothills of Jasper National Park and did some field research in 2015 west of Sundre. You know, it's a fantastic area, beautiful ecosystem that Alberta is so lucky to have, but it's highly developed in some areas for oil and gas and extensive clear-cut logging and lots of cattle out there, you know, that's supporting some of the economy in Alberta. But nobody's ever looked closely at all of these cumulative effects. So it's sort of being easy for the government to focus on the horses as causing damage. That's been going on for well over 100 years without any substantial evidence. So, you know, they do have a legitimate, valid reason to be looking at helping the rangeland health out there. But my report found out, that I'll get into later, is, you know, it's not really the horses, it's all these other things, including off-road vehicle damage to riparian areas and stuff, which is quite shocking when you see it. So, but yeah, so, you know, they're aiming in the right direction, but picking on the wrong animal.
Yeah. Can you tell me about the 3 population threshold ceilings in the framework and how the government arrived at these numbers?
Well, they arrived at the numbers by claiming they used carrying capacity and looked at wildlife use and cattle use, animal units per month, and so on. But when you look into the framework, they don't have any, you know, numbers or data to how they arrived at these sort of magical thresholds where they're going to have to take action. So most of it's based solely on thresholds of numbers. When a equine management zone reaches a certain number of animals based on their not so thorough and reliable helicopter counts, then they're going to take management action. So that seems to be, you know, what they're going to use from year to year. And if the horses were causing a lot of damage, and there was strong evidence of that, you know, then certainly some humane measures would have to be taken, but they're just ignoring all the other factors. And what I call, having reviewed the same situation in BC and the West Chilcotin and the BC East Kootenays, where all the horses have been eradicated thanks to the ranching community, it's a classic example of species scapegoating while not addressing the real other causes, in my professional opinion, which is based on, you know, a lot of background research and writing a book on wild horses of West Chilcotin and so on.
For sure. Thank you. What was the purpose of your review of the Alberta Feral Horse Management Framework for ZooCheck?
Well, the purpose was for me to do a professional review to see if there were legitimate cause for concern that the horses were now causing rangelands damage that they certainly weren't in 2015, and also seeing how valid their methodology was and what evidence and data they had to support what they call new sort of approach to managing the feral horses there. And so I did a thoroughly independent review. I've had 40 or 50 years of experience, written many management plans myself for different government agencies, mostly on grizzly bears and black bears and so on, but other species such as western toads and so on. So that's what I did. I was quite shocked in the end to find out that there wasn't a lot of science behind the framework.
For sure. I understand this is your second independent science review of the framework. The first was released in 2015, after which a horse cull was cut short. Which recommendations, if any, has the government incorporated from your first review?
They really haven't incorporated any, and that's because, as I'll try and explain more later on, is the report they submitted to the Wild Horse Advisory Committee And their response, well, this report isn't, even though it's done by a registered professional biologist, isn't peer reviewing, so we can't accept it. And that was used to cast aside my report. I'm not sure if anybody ever read it, but it was the misuse of the peer review process, in my opinion, because, a lot of the management reports done in the Alberta foothills and BC for wildlife and other species are done by professional biologists like myself or professional agrologists and with lots of experience in their fields of expertise. So it was a bit of a joke that the feral horse advisory committee there just ignored my report. The only thing they seem to have implemented is they now recognize for the first time that the Alberta policy now recognizes that foothills feral horses as having a legitimate place in the landscape. So that, I think, is quite significant compared to where they were in 2015 and some of the earlier big bounty hunts with aircraft and stuff where, the intent of the cattle industry, as it was in BC, was to eradicate the wild horses. And that's been partly successful in our BC interior grasslands, such as in the East Kootenays. But my research in the East Kootenays found that even though they eradicated the wild horses, it didn't. Recent study showed it didn't improve the rangeland health, so that tells you something. So that was good. That's the one positive thing. And I think the report in 2015 helped establish that there's not a lot of science to support their feral horse management and calls out there. And that message needed to get out. It reached the attention of the W5 program on CBC, and they did very good coverage and showed both sides. And, so it really increased public awareness of what's really going on in the foothills. And also, I think, raised public awareness a lot and also showed people, what a beautiful animal is this and what a wonderful heritage asset it is to all different Canadian cultures, including First Nations out in the foothills that, really needs to be protected.
Yeah, I find it super strange that despite all of your qualifications and all of the work you've done, that they would just dismiss it for something like it not being peer reviewed, even though you clearly know what you're talking about. That's, at least they took something from it, but I think that's just super unreasonable.
Yeah, well, they continued that this time. The person in charge of the range management there dismissed my report and tried to discredit it, claiming that I didn't. This time we had it peer reviewed by three scientists, two with PhDs, who have all studied the Alberta wild horse situation, had their boots on the ground there, including a scientist from the States with his PhD who's been involved in feral horse research and management for a long time, like myself. Yeah, so this time around, they tried to certainly misuse the peer review process by claiming that my report wasn't peer reviewed because I didn't list the peer reviews on the cover of my recent report. And when I wrote back and said, well, what's your policy? What's your policy for peer review? The answer was, we don't have any policy. So they were deliberately misusing the peer review process. And the normal peer review process, if you're going to publish in a journal, is that, the peer reviewers are experts in the field. The editor of the journal, as with my client here, Zoochak Canada, looks at different candidates for peer reviewer and selects the best experts available, and then sends the draft report to those peer reviewers. They send in their peer review, and those do get passed along to the author or the comments without the name of the peer reviewers in some cases. And the peer reviewers' names in published journals are kept confidential. They're not released. They're not put on the title of the paper. And so it's like the Alberta government created their own false policy to try and discredit my report for a second time. And so I pointed that out to them.
Yeah, that's that seems like they're doing it on purpose. Really, they don't want to accept the facts wherever it's possible. At least that's how I feel. I can't speak for them, but that's how it feels. What has happened to the wild horse population since the last cull 10 years ago?
They've undergone the normal up and down oscillations. They've increased in numbers, and then some years they've decreased. And studies elsewhere show that that's very typical of wild horse populations. And this quite dramatic oscillation from year to year is being largely ignored in the framework. They look at in their thresholds, setting thresholds, they might implement a removal or cull or contraception once, for example, a sundry zone has reached that red light or red zone level, and do some removals, even though the next year there might be a severe winter or more wolf predation or a drought, and the numbers would be dropping naturally without control measures, because that's the way wild horse populations have been shown to go. So, that's the other danger of their program, is that it totally ignores this. So, yeah, they've gone up and down, and that's partly because they have a higher fertility and survival rate together with reproduction at the expense of maternal survival relative to males. So there's also some evidence that the rate of free-ranging horse population declines markedly at high densities, but increases at low densities. So, that's based on long-term study elsewhere. This is all ignored, but does show up in their horse counts. They're going up and down. The numbers sometimes look crazy because they're based on their annual counts, which they now acknowledge prior to 2017 weren't as reliable as the more recent count. So you kind of get into this numbers game. And based on, again, like I say, on not a lot of evidence that the horses have or ever will, because of the natural predation and starvation winters, which is being documented in the past by the Forest Service, are going to overrun the range and make all the cattle starve and impact the elk and stuff. That's never happened, and it's not going to happen, especially when you have 6 times more cattle out there during the 6 months heavy grazing season, grass growing season in that ecosystem than you do wild horses.
Absolutely. What are the key findings of your latest study, which was released in November of 2024?
Well, they're basically, as I covered that, again, as in 2015, they're planning on carrying out in their framework more population reductions if their horse numbers justify that. But what I couldn't find is in their framework, they claim we're using carrying capacity. Well, I couldn't find their report on that, or where they had documented the carrying capacity for deer, for an elk, for cattle and wild horses, that would support this population. So, and then I couldn't find any evidence, I'm repeating myself, that the horses were causing range damage. Yeah, so that was my main finding. There just didn't seem to be any on-the-ground evidence to support the necessity for this intensive monitoring, having some population controls at times when numbers naturally go up. So, yeah, that's sort of it in a nutshell. It was really interesting to find that again. And I concluded that using annual horse count thresholds to determine horse control measures is an unreliable method, since if you leave them unmanaged, they undergo these dramatic fluctuations. Yeah, so, and they also ignored the fact that, studies have done, and very good studies on predation on grazing wild grazers, including horses and elk and deer, foothills, wolves and mountain lions, shows in some years there's a fair bit of that predation. A wolf study west of Rocky Mountain House, done over 3 years with collared wolves, found that deer represented 22% of the biomass killed, elk 23%, moose 43%, and free-ranging horses 12%. of the total biomass that these packs of wolves killed. So the ecosystem's doing its job, so to speak. And I think what's really amazing is of all the wild horses left in North America, most of them being in the States, the second largest one left in Canada is in the foothills. It's one of two places where you still have all of the natural predators, most of which are being eliminated in the States. The West Chilcotin being the other area where you also have all the natural predators. So, Mother Nature's doing her job. And you got to keep in mind that these horses evolved in North America with all of these predators. The Yukon horse, before it went extinct 5,000 years ago, evolved in glacier refugium, believe it or not, in northern Yukon, which was ice-free because it was too dry for ice to form. And they live with the gray wolf that didn't go extinct after the last ice age, whereas the horse did, but it survived in North America and, of course, was reintroduced by the Spaniards in the early 1500s. So, yeah, so it's all fascinating.
That is really interesting. I understand the government relied on 5 background reports on feral horses prepared by the Office of the Chief Scientist, and that you completed a partial review of these reports. What did you discover?
I discovered a bunch of things, and I just have to find my notes on that. One of the things they did is again, I think, and I've never heard this approach before, they limited their review to peer-reviewed published report. And that discredits credible reports done by members of professional associations, Alberta biologists, BC biologists, agrologists, and so on. And I think that it was a huge oversight in their part because they limited themselves to mostly peer-reviewed studies done elsewhere, or some studies done in the foothills that were published, but left out a whole bunch of other things, including my own 2015 report. So that sort of gave it, I think, a skewed background they provided to the Feral Horse Advisory Committee and the author of the framework. They also excluded a genetic study done by world equine genetic expert Dr. Guth Cothran that he did east of Sundre using a lot more samples and from remote areas than the university study they quoted, where he actually found that the main ancestry of the horses west of Sundre are the Spanish Iberian horses with some draft influences and Canadian horse influences that were bred across the prairies into the foothills by First Nations and introduced there in the 1600s. This is really key background that was totally left out of their approach, and I think it still allows the government to still classify them as recently escaped domestic species and that sort of thing. They excluded the detailed analysis of many years of available range health and riparian reports. So why are the cattle industry even doing this, getting this information, which, by the way, I'll get into later. Another Brian DeCock, an agrologist who reviewed this, showed that the horses were causing little damage, but so they excluded that. This is key information that's very relevant to see if a framework is needed. They included a review of global impacts of feral horses focused on documented negative habitat impacts to the exclusion of available research that demonstrates the value of free-roaming horses to ecosystem functioning and health. So again, that was kind of skewed in a direction and extrapolating from horses in other countries, many places which have lost all their predators, to a totally different ecosystem. You have to be very careful when you do that. It's okay to do it, but you got to include the baseline research, whether it's peer reviewed or not, from the very ecosystem you're dealing with. They also quoted some of the material out of context. That involved a very good study done by Salter and Hudson in the foot range research west of Sundre, and this was a peer-reviewed study pointing out that the risk of adverse effects of grazing by feral horses is likely greatest in grasslands that experience heavy use, while omitting key information and context from Salter's research that found very little evidence that free-roaming horses were actually causing the range damage. So they did a good job of reviewing the papers they did. I didn't have a lot of problems with that, but these kind of omissions or quoting out of context, doesn't present the whole picture. And my role as a scientist is to look at all sides and objectively report on, lots of things. And obviously, if I found strong evidence that the foothills feral horses were causing a significant range damage, I wouldn't be critical of their framework and management things as long as it's done humanely. So another thing they omitted was a worldwide review of wolves and free-ranging horses that concluded that grazing helps control plant biomass and reduces the risk of wildfires, as well as providing a stable food source for large predators, which in turn reduces wolf attacks on economically valuable livestock such as cattle. And that was a peer-reviewed paper published in 2001. This is key information, very relevant to the situation. Wolves reduce wolf attacks on economically valuable livestock because they prey on free-ranging horses and other species. Why was that ignored? I don't know. It's a shame that it was. But anyhow, that was my conclusion reviewing what I did.
Yeah, it seems like they left out quite a bit of stuff based on your findings. Some quite a few valid points seemed like they were omitted. Okay.
Yeah, well, one of the other things that should have been considered was a peer-reviewed study done in 2005 that pointed out there's little information on forest productivity of Alberta vegetation communities used for grazing that would foster the formulation of reliable and non-detrimental carrying capacities for the main grazing species in the foothills. And this study said there is little data on the levels of utilization which are detrimental to a plant community's health. Traditionally, these community types have been rated at 5 acres animal units or 60 acres a head year, but recent work has shown that productivity can vary significantly depending on the ecological conditions of the site. So why wasn't that considered or included? This is an Alberta study of great importance. They don't appear to have done more recent research, but anyhow, there you go.
Perfect. What do you know about the damage to the rangeland caused by cattle, OHV use, oil and gas development, invasive plant species, and clear-cut logging?
Well, most of that I know from an independent review of the 2015 rangeland health and riparian reports. My client Zuchuk, it took him 10 years to Freedom of Information to get this, and it was reviewed by an independent professional agrologist, Brian DeCock, and I referred to his report here. I think you will be interviewing him. I hope so.
Yep.
And those reports, which looked at localized areas, found that the horses alone were causing very little damage, and most of the damage was caused by all the other factors, including cattle graze and off-highway ATV and vehicle use and clear-cut logging and so on. So that was quite revelatory. It's not surprising since there's 6 times as many cows out there as horses during the 6 months of the year. What was also interesting when I look more closely at some of the other range studies, of which there's been few, I did quote the one by Salter and Hudson, which was done in the late 1970s, who found very little evidence of free-roaming horses west of Sundre were causing range damage. And also a study done in the Elbow EM zone, which is an isolated horse zone south of the Trans-Canada Highway, in Kananaskis country and so on, where it worked, where there's a small number of horses. And they use radio-collared horses there, 4 different bands. in an area where there were 12 times as many cattle as horses. That is, there were 131 free-roaming horses and 1,600 cattle and wild ungulates, and they did not document any serious range degradation by the horses either. So, like I say, the evidence points to other causes besides the horses.
Absolutely. How was this?
So I jumped ahead to 7, yeah.
Yeah, I guess, how was this cumulative damage by other sources taken into consideration when developing the framework?
They claim to have included rangeland health reports, but there's no evidence that they did, or they would have come to probably similar conclusions as the independent review by Brian DeCoe, So I didn't see where they had quantified this or used it, documented as background evidence in their framework, which is normal procedure. First of all, you had in a typical management plan, you identify there's a problem, you research all the data, especially field data, that supports that, and then you come up with some management recommendations to mitigate the problem. So that was, excluded, even though they claimed, just like they didn't give you the numbers for carrying capacity, which apparently don't exist, according to one of the studies.
Yeah. So Zoom sent me a pop-up. We have about 4 minutes left in this particular meeting.
Okay.
So I'm hoping that we can just restart the meeting. I may have to send you like a new Zoom link to join. But yeah, Zoom only gives us about 40 minutes per call. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Just wanted to give you some warning so that we don't get cut off in the middle of a question, because, yeah. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode, the first of 2 parts of my interview with Wayne McCrory. The amount of support we have received from you has really meant a lot, and it brings us closer to seeing these animals saved. A huge thank you to everyone that I was lucky enough to interview this season. If you want to help, there are a ton of different things you can do. If you live in Canada, you can write to your local member of parliament or directly to the Minister of Parks in Alberta. If you don't live in Canada, or you're not as comfortable doing that, you may wish to follow the Help Alberta Wildies Society or HAWS on Facebook to get more involved and see what other things you can do. And of course, every like and comment means a lot, and clicking subscribe on YouTube will do even more for us. Every little bit truly does help and allows me to show tangible proof that people care. If you would be so kind as to share this with friends or family that you think might be interested in this topic, or who you think would want to help, I would really appreciate it. Next week, I will be continuing my interview with Wayne McCrory, and we will explore even more with him. If you would like to follow us on social media, you can find us on Twitter, or it's X now, and Blue Sky, using the tag @TheWildyWest. For any business inquiries, please contact us at thewildywest@gmail.com. I'm your host, Chase McGoran. Thank you once again for listening to The Wildy West.